A reading from the Gospel of John, chapter 15, verses 1 through 8. I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine grower. He removes every branch in me that bears no fruit. Every branch that bears fruit, he prunes to make it bear more fruit. You have already been cleansed by the word that I have spoken to you. Abide in me as I abide in you. Just as the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. Those who abide in me and I in them bear much fruit, because apart from me you can do nothing. Whoever does not abide in me is thrown away like a branch and withers. Such branches are gathered, thrown into the fire, and burned. If you abide in me and my words abide in you, ask for whatever you wish, and it will be done for you. My Father is glorified by this, that you bear much fruit and become my disciples.
In C.S. Lewis's The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the great lion Aslan appears at strategic moments in the story to save the four lost children from danger and guide them home. But before the children meet Aslan, they befriend two kind beavers who tell them all about the great lion, and suddenly the children aren't so sure they ever want to meet him. Is he safe? Asks one of the girls. I shall feel quite nervous about meeting a lion. That you will, says Mrs. Beaver. If there's anyone who can appear before Aslan without their knees knocking, they're either braver than most or just silly. Then he isn't safe? Asks Lucy. Safe, says Mr. Beaver. Who said anything about safe? Of course he isn't safe, but he's good. He's the king. In the fictional land of Narnia, Aslan represents the Christ figure, the incarnation of God. And if we're trying to describe God from our limited human perspective, perhaps Mrs. Beaver's description would be a great place to start. This idea that God isn't entirely safe, but that God is unquestionably good. And by that we mean God, like the great lion Aslan, is no one's pet. God will do what God will do, and God will be what God will be. God is unquestionably good, but God isn't entirely safe. If by safe we mean tame or predictable or powerless. When C.S. Lewis conceived of the great lion Aslan, he had in mind this same tension we all hold when we think about the goodness of God on the one hand and the power of God on the other. One of the oldest questions humans have been asking about God is how to reconcile the goodness of God with the power of God. And the argument goes something like this. If God is all powerful and all loving, then why do bad things happen in the world? If, for example, a bus is about to run me over and God, who presumably loves me, has the power to stop that bus but does not, can it then be true still that God is both all powerful and all loving? In our Bible, the book of Job was written to address this very question, and it doesn't give us any clear answers, by the way. It simply voices this honest, timeless dilemma about God's love and God's power. And if you've ever found yourself asking that question, maybe Aslan is a great metaphor, a good but not entirely safe God. It holds gently this tension of God's love and God's power, only it's a different kind of power than what we might have assumed with God. We assume that when we speak about God's power, we're talking about the mightiest kind of power in the world, at least according to the worldly standards we have, that is. And what is that kind of power? Well, it's the kind of power to exert one's will to get one's way, right? The power to make things happen. The theological word we often use for that is omnipotence. It means all-powerful. And for most people, it means controlling power. And people often think of God up in the clouds, pulling strings, pushing levers, manipulating the system, if you will. Maybe it's not quite direct intervention. It's more like just fixing or rigging the game a bit so we don't really have much agency or free will. As if God's already got it all mapped out, in other words. But think for a moment about your human relationships and how awful controlling power is. Have you ever known someone who thinks of power in this way? Someone in a position of power, or even someone who claims to love or care about you, who is super controlling or who even abuses that power in some way. Does that sound like a good God? Some people think of God's omnipotence as coercive power. People might think of God as up there in the clouds, but occasionally intervening supernaturally, like stopping that bus from running me over. We don't know why, but sometimes God gets involved. Sometimes God doesn't, and we're told it's none of our business. Again, think about your human relationships. Have you ever known someone in a position of power who used their power simply to get their way, steamrolling over everyone to get their way in every way, and to accomplish their personal agenda, and then they tell you, just don't ask questions? Did you feel seen or heard or valued in that? Did you have any input or agency? And ask yourself, does that sound like a good God? If control or coercion is what it means to be truly powerful, and we apply that definition to God, it can be very hard to trust God. And I talk with people who have walked away from faith because this is the only God they've ever been told about. A God who controls everything and makes things happen coercively. And when everything in life seems like it's under control and wonderful things are happening and our faith says this is all God's doing, that kind of God is pretty easy to believe in. But when everything in life is out of control and terrible things are happening, or when our life is stuck and it feels like God is absent and our faith is saying that this is all somehow God's doing and don't ask questions, well, that kind of God becomes very hard to believe in. And that kind of God doesn't feel very good. And so I hear it often, why did God do this to me? Or how could God allow that to happen to me? Or what did I do to deserve this? Most of my conversations these days about faith are with people trying to figure out how to still believe in God, because they've seen so much hard stuff, trauma, tragedy, inexplicable suffering in their lives and in the world, so much that it's difficult to believe that a God who could have prevented it but did not could still be called good and loving. And it isn't that they do not want to believe in God, it's that they want to believe in a good and loving God, a God that at least makes sense, even if we're still talking about a God who may not be entirely safe. Let me explain what I mean. Because the God Jesus knew intimately and spoke tenderly about is a good and powerful God. A God who is not coercive, and yet a God who is still powerful. yet whose power is expressed in particular ways that push and prod rather than coerce. Push and prod us to become more than we are. And Jesus puts it in this way in our passage today. He says, I am the true vine, and my Father is a vineyard keeper. And He removes any of my branches that don't produce fruit. He trims any branch that produces fruit so that it will produce even more fruit. And isn't that a beautiful image of our life in deep communion with Christ? I love the relational, organic metaphor of being connected to a living vine, being cared for by a wise, hands-on, nurturing gardener. This summer, Lori and I toured the winding terraced vineyards of some of the Douro Valley's quintas, or plantations in Portugal, and we learned about the country's beloved port wine. And growing grapes in the Douro Valley is labor-intensive. It's meticulous work, a labor of love. It dates back to the 8th century BC. The machines there are unable to navigate these steep hillsides. Cistercian monks, later families, they devoted themselves to cultivation practices that transformed that landscape, transformed even the very spirit of their culture over many centuries. And when you're there, you can feel this harmonious marriage of soil and climate and topography and the people. And it comes from this love and sacrifice of working the land and the vineyards. When Jesus spoke of this vine metaphor, his audience could immediately relate. They knew about vineyards and pruning and cutting away dead and overgrown stuff. Even today, we can look at a plant, a shrub, or a tree, and we tend to kind of know when a branch or a limb or even a stem needs to be cut away to restore life or promote growth, or when it needs to be pruned to redirect growth to areas that the plant needs most. It's what a good gardener must do. Jesus says there are seasons when God removes the dead stuff in our lives, seasons when God does some pruning, even among the healthy branches, just to ensure that we're still growing and bearing fruit. But if removing and pruning is the hard work that God does with us, that means the hard work of the branches, us, is living with the knowledge that even as we cling to the vine and trust in the love and wisdom of the vine dresser, we're still going to experience the spiritual surgery, if you will, that in the end will lead to a more fruitful life. Sometimes God removes the dead stuff and it hurts because maybe it didn't look dead to us, or because we were in denial that it was actually dead to begin with. And sometimes God prunes part of our lives and it hurts because it looks so good to us, or it seems so perfect or promising at the time. But maybe you're wondering what specifically that removing and pruning looks like, and how can we know whether it's God who's doing it or if it's just life or circumstance? Like when you don't survive the next round of corporate layoffs. Is that God cutting away the dead branches? When the bank staples the notice to vacate sign on your front door, is that God pruning your vine? When the divorce papers are served, is that God pruning to make you more fruit-bearing later? Whenever we talk about the painful experiences we suffer in life, we're always just one ignorant cliche away from sounding too much like Job's 3 friends, giving pious answers to unsearchable questions that are way above our pay grade. When it feels like our branches are getting cut or pruned, the last thing we need is someone telling us that our pain is actually God's way of loving us or God's way of shaping our spiritual character. That feels more like a coercive, controlling way of loving, doesn't it? So I want you to hear this. Any so-called act of love that must justify the suffering of the beloved in order to express love should never be considered love. In our human relationships, we call such actions abusive. And God's love is never, ever abusive. God's loving aims are always generative. God's love always responds out of a deep desire to work for our good and to call forth life in us. What Jesus in our teaching today describes as fruit bearing. And Jesus says some branches in our lives simply do not bear fruit because they are dead. And he says God removes only dead branches. Did you hear that? Jesus does not say God removes or cuts away living branches from us. And we do not know how exactly God does the removing of dead branches because it doesn't say here. This is just a metaphor. But we do know how often and how desperately we cling to dead branches, and how hard it is to let go of what we know will never grow. A dead-end job that we just can't quit. A lifeless relationship we just can't quite let go of. An unhealed trauma, a past regret, a wound that continues to drain us of life. A story we tell about ourselves, about why we are the way we are and why we cannot change. Or what about the social, societal branches that aren't giving life? Systems of evil that perpetuate racism or hatred or violence or war. All these dead branches that just cannot bear fruit. God removes them, and Jesus doesn't say how God does that, but most often in the Bible, God does it through people, especially through prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Micah, John the Baptist. They all showed up with an axe in their hands, so to speak, and went to work on the dead branches of their nation. Jesus says God wants to remove dead, lifeless stuff. All the obstacles, excuses, hindrances that keep us from bearing fruit and becoming more. William Frey was an Episcopal bishop from Colorado years ago. He wrote a book, The Dance of Hope, in which he wrote about volunteering to read to an older student named John who was blind. And one day Frey asked John, this student, how he had lost his eyesight, and John described a chemical explosion at the age of 13. He said it felt like his life was over. He felt helpless. He hated God. For the first 6 months, he did nothing but stay in his room alone, but then a curious thing happened. One day his dad entered the room and said, "John, winter's coming and the storm windows need to be up, and that's your job. And I want those windows hung by the time I get back this evening." John's father turned, walked out of the room. John was so angry that he thought, who does he think he is? Who does he think I am? I'm blind. John was so furious that he decided to do it, believing that if he fell off the ladder and hurt himself in the process, his parents would feel even worse. He felt his way to the garage. He found the windows, located the necessary tools, found the ladder, all the while muttering under his breath, "I'll show them. I'll fall and they'll have a blind and paralyzed son too." Eventually he got the windows up before evening. In the process, he came to realize that he could still work and that he could begin to reconstruct his life. It was the breakthrough he needed. And he also said something else. He said, 7 years later, I learned something else happened that day. The entire day as I worked to get the windows up, my Father was no more than 3 or 4 feet from me the whole time. God removes dead branches, not living branches. If it's dead, look out, it's not safe. God will eventually mess with it. That's what makes God such a good and trustworthy God. Not a safe God, but a good God. God wants the best for us. But there's one other powerful and uncomfortable truth here that Jesus makes about being connected to the so-called vine. He says that even after removing the branches that aren't bearing any fruit because they're dead, the vine dresser still isn't finished with the vine. Jesus says that God trims any branch that produces fruit so that it will produce even more fruit. Maybe you're looking at your life and you can see some fruitfulness. You can see some success. You can see where things are really going just fine. Maybe you're growing in some areas of your life, professionally, relationally, spiritually. Well, Jesus says that God trims even that. Not cuts it away, but trims it. Why? Maybe it's because it's not uncommon for us as humans to only want what we've always had. And sometimes we settle for what we've already got. And sometimes we can't imagine becoming any more than we already are, and yet God's call is always toward becoming. God is always asking us, who will you be next? Because the thing about all that fruit on the vine is that it all dies. What is ripe today will be gone tomorrow. Is your life prepared to bear more fruit tomorrow? Well, that requires pruning. And maybe pruning is something akin to hearing sometimes life say no to you. Can you think of a time in your life when you were told no by someone or some circumstance or something? Maybe everything was trending up for you one day and lining up just perfectly, and then you got snipped by life, pruned by circumstance or just bad luck, and the opportunity was gone, and it felt like a major loss, only you discovered months or years later that it turned out to be the best thing that could have happened to you. Maybe, as they say, one door closed and another opened. Maybe it served as a catalyst to improve yourself. Maybe you got broken and then you got stronger in the broken places. I'm speaking now from experience. Jesus is right. We do grow by pruning. It's how we become more. But only, he says, if we abide with him. Abide. It means to remain, to stay. The way Jesus uses the word, it means, I think, don't hit the eject button, but cling to me, even when it hurts and you don't understand. And we live in such a runaway culture. We have our finger conveniently over the eject button all the time, especially when it comes to faith. When hardship strikes and we are faced with disappointment with God, we just push the button and move on. It's easier to eject than to abide with God. And yet abide defines how we live in communion with Christ, how we endure and remain. Because the vine dresser is never closer to us than in those moments when the dead branches are being cut away and even the living branches are getting pruned. Never is God closer than in those moments when we don't think we can get through it. And that's why Jesus says, abide with me. Don't hit the eject button and abandon the vine. Instead, trust the vine dresser who with great love and tenderness removes the dead branches and prunes even the good branches, because while this God is not entirely safe, this God is entirely good. Our takeaways for today: God is unquestionably good, but God isn't entirely safe. God removes dead branches and prunes living branches. God is never closer than in those moments when we don't think we can get through it.